This is Fred Antil, and this morning I'm delighted to be talking to Tim Mollen. Let me read you from Tim Mollen's website. He says, I'm a freelance writer and actor living in Greater Binghamton, New York. This site contains information about my freelance services, my syndicated humor column, and two charities I'm involved with, Project PAW and the Jim Mollen Memorial Education Fund. Tim, I'm looking at two columns here. I know you from the column that appears each week in the Life section of the Ithaca Journal.
Yes.
And you call it the Lost Journal.
That's right.
And that's an interesting gimmick. Tell us how you got to this point and come up with this idea for the column, and tell our listeners what it is.
Basically, the concept of the column is that writers are all taught that they should keep a journal. So when I was hired as a professional writer, in a sense, well, not in a sense, I guess I am, I decided that it would be fun to write a journal in retrospect, to kind of cheat, because I never kept a journal, so I'll make it up now. So I each week take a different day from my past and write about it as though it was today. So people ask when they've read a bunch of them, did you actually keep a journal when you were a little kid? I say, nope. This is just a fun way of writing a column in kind of a quirky, different perspective. So I'll write sometimes about the day I was born or when I was 5 years old. So it's stuff that I don't necessarily remember, but that I can reconstruct and kind of have fun with. So it's more a humor column than an autobiography. And the way I got into it was I teach an improvisational comedy workshop from time to time at the Endicott Performing Arts Center. And one of the students in that class about 5 or 6 years ago was an editor at the Binghamton Press and Sun Bulletin. And he wrote a humor column at the time. So I ran into him and told him that I liked his column and told him that he'd be good at doing improv comedy probably. So I invited him to take my workshop. So that resulted in him bringing a bunch of his coworkers to see the show, the performance at the end of the workshop. And they all enjoyed it. The editors enjoyed it. And one of them approached me at a store I was working at the time, said he enjoyed the show. And I said, I write comedy too. I write humor pieces. Would you be willing to take a look at something? So they started periodically, kind of a sporadic basis, publishing my columns. So they weren't lost journal columns at the beginning. They were every 6 weeks or so. I would just pick a topic and they'd print it. Then that editor, who was writing a regular humor column, moved on to a bigger publication down in Delaware. And I approached the editor and said, "Hey, I'd love to have that weekly slot if you'd be willing to give me a try." And that was mid-2005. So yeah, my very first column in the Binghamton Press was January of 2004, and then a year and a half later I started writing the Lost Journal column itself.
Well, I tell you, there's a lot of fans here in Ithaca, and I get a kick out of it. But I think that probably writing is one thing, but writing to be funny, that has to be one of the biggest challenges I think that any writer could take on. But you do stand-up, you said also, is that right?
Not stand-up so much as improvisational comedy, more in a theatrical sense. There was a show that was popular a few years ago with Drew Carey called Whose Line Is It Anyway?
Oh, yes.
So there's kind of theater games that are done on stage where you're making up funny scenes in front of an audience, all off the top of your head. So that's more of my training, is kind of fast on your feet, off-the-cuff wit. And it's served me well in this context, I guess.
And your role models might be?
Oh, the folks who, some of your older listeners might remember a show that I loved as a kid called SCTV, which stood for Second City Television, and they were all improvisational actors who came out of the Second City Comedy Troupe in Toronto and Chicago. So people like John Candy, Martin Short, Eugene Levy, Andrea Martin, Catherine O'Hara, Rick Moranis. So they were my heroes. As a kid in middle school, I was staying up until 12:30 on a Friday night to watch this obscure Canadian comedy show. So they were the people I looked up to.
Well, you're a trained actor, too, so you do acting when you can.
Yep.
Anything coming up, anything that we should be aware of?
Well, I'll be auditioning for and hopefully appearing for the third time in Shakespeare in the Park in Endicott with the Endicott Performing Arts Center. Last year, I was thrilled to get a chance to play Iago in Othello. As a comic actor, I was thrilled to get to sink my teeth into a dramatic role. He's one of Shakespeare's greatest villains, so that was a lot of fun. So this summer they're doing The Merry Wives of Windsor, and we'll see what happens when I audition.
Well, good luck.
Thank you.
Looking at the two columns I have here, one is Coping with an ID Crisis at Age 1. So that was you were 1 year old and you were doing your journal there, and that would have been 1970. And then the other one was Bat Day was a Bad Day for Ball Game, and that was when you were 7. But you mentioned members of your family, and you mentioned friends. A little fiction now there, or is there some basis in fact in most of these stories?
The way I put it is that the column is based on a true story, and that the events in general all happened, but I'm reconstructing a lot of the details. And sometimes it's tongue-in-cheek stuff that I'm commenting on current events from a kind of foreshadowing perspective. So the major event that happens in any particular column did actually happen, and I try to reconstruct as accurately as I can the situation. But I have to make up, what people actually said or what day of the week it was, those kinds of things. So if it were published as a book, which I hope to do someday, it probably would be published more as a nostalgic humor type book as opposed to autobiography. In other words, it wouldn't pass Oprah's test of authenticity.
But when your family and friends listen to it, they can recognize it.
Oh, yeah. They all live those experiences with me. And then occasionally, not even occasionally, quite often, I will break out of that structure and just write something goofy that's occurred to me. My next column is about American Idol and this whole kerfuffle about this woman, Susan Boyle, and her performance in Britain, and how people are going bonkers over that, and my reaction to that. So sometimes I break out of the structure to just do a straightforward, hopefully funny commentary.
Well, thank you for making us laugh, and congratulations. I know that the column is expanding. You're in California, you're in a number of other places, and I hope much success to you. Thank you, Tim Mollen.
Thanks, Fred.